Good day and welcome back to The Shed. Today we go back to 2022 and we'll take a look at the Nebula award-winning novel for that year by Djeli Clark. I think that's how you pronounce it. A Master of Djinn. So this was a rather interesting novel. So what I would like to do, as always, is provide a bit of a spoiler-free plot overview. I'll talk to what I liked, what I didn't like. Now, I normally put these books to a memory test. So this is my first reading of this one. So I'll sort of provide a bit of commentary as to how I think this one would hold up to time, and I'll make some recommendations based on similar novels that we've covered to date on the Sci-Fi Shed Ladder, where I've been ranking all these Hugo and Nebula award-winning novels. So the year is 1912 in Cairo, Egypt, in this alternate history novel where magic has been reintroduced into our society. Some 40 years prior, Al-Jahiz created a rift between our world and the magical realm, which has resulted in all these genies and other mythical creatures integrated into our way of lives and into our world. And right from the onset, we have a murder mystery happening right in front of our eyes. We have this secret brotherhood who is being brutally murdered by this masked individual in mysterious circumstances. We are then introduced to Fatma el-Sha'arawi, who works for the Ministry of Alchemy, Enchantments and Supernatural Entities. And she's a sort of a private investigator of sorts, and she's sort of working with the police to try to figure out exactly what it is. So the story follows on from a novella that Djeli Clark wrote in A Dead Genie in Cairo. So Fatma was introduced in that novelette, and she sort of takes on from where she left off in that previous novel, now investigating this murder. So Fatma has reluctantly taken on a partner in a lady called Hadia, and together with the police and some interesting informants, take on this mystery to find out exactly who this masked murderer is, what their motivations were, and can somehow this motley crew of detectives, police and informants do something to change the current state of affairs. So I found it to be a rather interesting novel, this one. So what is there to like in Djeli Clark's A Master of Djinn? I'd have to say that for me, the highlight was definitely the world building. I thought it was a really interesting steampunk alternate history that Djeli Clark has painted for us here, and I thought it was by far the standout for me. I can't remember seeing genies focused so much in a piece of science fiction. I may be mistaken in that, but I don't think it has been done before, and for me it was definitely refreshing and one of the key takeaways that I took from this one. I also enjoyed the premise. I've mentioned it in the past that I like my science fiction murder mystery novels, and this sort of started off that way, and the characters were fine as well. I did enjoy the characters. I thought they had some interesting quirks that will make them memorable, but it also talks to some of my dislikes. So when it comes to the dislikes, I'd have to say that the characters just were not quite there for me. I mean, Fatma was supposed to be this up and rising star in the Ministry of Alchemy, Enchantments and Supernatural Entities, but I didn't quite understand what this ministry actually did. Because if we were to take Fatma as a role model, because she was seen as this up and rising star and probably the best that the ministry had to offer, I just found it really confusing as to exactly what is it that these people do. Because I would argue that she didn't really have great investigative procedural processes in place. She seemed to be just stumbling away through this. And when it comes to the magic elements, she seemed to be just as surprised and naive as the rest of the police force. So I wasn't quite sure exactly how this ministry added any value to the world at large, and why the police force couldn't just do this by themselves. So I found that rather odd. I mean, the characters were enjoyable, but I just thought there was some major gaps in there when it comes to the plot that I just couldn't get my head around. The other thing I'd have to say that the plot itself is a bit lackluster for me. There was a couple of weird things. Like I mentioned, I like the premise, this murder mystery, but I don't think it really was a murder mystery. It wasn't really difficult to put two and two together and understand exactly what was going on here. So when it comes to the main antagonist, the three motivators that I had just did not make any sense to me. I mean, two of them were obsolete because of the third. And I just couldn't reconcile that in my head. I thought, if you want to do all these things and you're doing all this because of A, B, and C, why not just do C and get it over and done with? So I don't know, there's a couple of gaps there in the plot and the characters that were a bit of a stumbling block for me, giving this a full 5 out of 5. But probably the worst of it all for me was the writing. I don't know if it was a stylistic approach that Djeli Clark took here. I have not read the novelette, the short stories that preceded this. So I'd love to have a go at those, because I just found the writing here was a bit of a stumbling block for me. It wasn't so much for the pacing. I thought the pacing was fine. I thought the novel action sort of moved along and the plot moved along quite nicely, but it was the sentence structures themselves that had me jolting, in the sense that there were many paragraphs in this novel that were just made up of 2 or 3 word sentences, and it would just say stop, start, like paragraphs. I could read some for you, but I'll leave that up to you to pick up the book and have a read, because I still think it's worthwhile. But yeah, just the short sentence paragraphs, just, I don't know, they just had me stop, start, that I just did not enjoy, and it really did take away from me really thoroughly enjoying this one. So when it comes to recommendations, look, I still recommend this one. I thought it was a fun read and really interesting concept that had me engaged from cover to cover. And I'm always being just a little bit more critical just to help me rank these ones. But I don't want to take away anything from Djeli Clark. I think it was still a worthwhile novel. And as a debut novel, I've got to say, it's right up there, some of the better debut novels that I've read. But I'd have to say there were definitely a couple of hurdles in there for me to get over. But similar books that we've looked at and ranked today on the Sci-Fi Shed ladder would be those sort of weird fiction type novels. The like of Paolo Bacigalupi's The Wind-Up Girl. I saw similarities here in the world building, some of the steampunk elements that we saw in Bacigalupi's world. So I'd say if you've enjoyed The Wind-Up Girl and you like that sort of steampunk alternate history, or this is a future history type novel, I'd say have a go at A Master of Djinn, because I think you will see similarities, and I think if you like one or the other, you will enjoy them both. The other one that comes to mind when we're talking about integrating myth and science fiction would be Lord Zelazny, I was going to say. Some might argue that that's a valid title for Roger Zelazny, but I was referring to Lord of Light. Again, this takes some of those Hindu myths and blends them into a science fiction realm. So if you've enjoyed this, I'd say have a go at Paolo Bacigalupi's... Paolo Bacigalupi. I'm really going berserk tonight. I meant take a look at A Master of Djinn by Djeli Clark, and I think you will see similarities there, and you'll enjoy it as well. One that I don't have at hand would be the other debut novel that we've got on the board so far, in The Saint of Bright Doors by Chandrasekhara, because that also was this alternate history. It was almost alternate present reality type lines, and it had a mixture of fantasy and science that was really interesting. And again, I saw similarities there with A Master of Djinn and what we saw in The Saint of Bright Doors. So I think if you enjoyed that novel, you will also enjoy this one. So when it comes to the memory test, this one's going to be rather interesting because it is the first time I've read it. But I say there are definitely elements in this novel that will be memorable. I think that world and the world setting honestly was a highlight. I really did enjoy the world, that steampunk magic vibe that it had to it. And I think that if I was to revisit this book in 10, 15 years, I would not have forgotten the setting of A Master of Djinn. I would say that maybe Fatma and Siti, the two main protagonists in the novel, I would say could be memorable. Time will tell, but I don't think the plot would be. I just don't think the plot had enough in it to really stand the test of time. But I'd say the world setting definitely has potential, and that's what I'll be basing my input criteria on when we go and rank it on our Sci-Fi Shed ladder. So let me flip the cameras around and see Shed ladder and ranking Djeli Clark's debut Nebula award-winning novel for 2022, A Master of Djinn. Now this is going to be an interesting one when we look at my full criteria, which I've documented below, because I'd have to say from a concept point of view, this one got really good marks. I thought the concept was great. I really did enjoy that, retro, alternate history, steampunk vibe to it with all these genies and the different classes of genies. And it was a world that I'm sure has got many sequels in it if Djeli Clark desires to do so. Really fascinating setting, so got really good marks for the concepts. But I think the execution is where it failed a little for me, and the plot, right? I mentioned to it in my dislikes, and the writing as well. I just think that those three things just did not quite have what it takes to be on A or necessarily even the B-side for me, but we'll work our way through it. Because I thought the characters were good, they were enjoyable characters, but I think there was a bit of a fixation on what Fatma was wearing, more than what you would expect to see in a police procedural when we're talking murder mystery novels, right? I would have liked to have seen more of that police procedural in there to get us into the mind of these ministry staff and how they worked. And I think a little bit less focus on what she's wearing, which I thought was cool, right? She had a wonderful wardrobe, but I think there was more emphasis on that than anything else that let that character down a little for me. As well as the plot, I think if we're going to have a villain, you know, that villain's motivation has to be rock solid. And I just don't think it was in here. So I lost some points for the plot and the characters here, as well as the writing. Look, honestly, the thing that's really going to stop it being on the B-side even is the writing. I don't know. I just did not really work for me, the writing. I thought there were moments that was really good, but a lot of it I just didn't quite allow me to get immersed in the novel. For example, when I was reading some of these paragraphs, and it almost seems to be like 50-60% of this, where you have, you know, these two or three word sentences, I started rearranging those sentences in my head when I was reading to get the story flowing. And I cannot remember ever doing that in a novel, ever. I mean, sometimes, you know, sentence structures like that add to the drama, add to the punctuation, to the punch that you'd expect. But I thought it was just overdone, and I don't think it quite really delivered what I think the author meant to deliver, because for me it was just a distraction. So it's not going to make the B-side, unfortunately. So let's have a look at what we've got. I mean, we've got The Wind-Up Girl, which I sort of mentioned on B-side, right? But I did mention that even though that novel had some thoughts and I had some question marks as to, you know, the alternate technology there, would it have been any better than just traditional tech? So there was a couple of issues I had with the plot as well, but I really did enjoy Paolo Bacigalupi's writing. And the interesting thing is that altogether, I thought Master of Djinn was a really interesting novel, but I couldn't wind it. I couldn't rank it above The Wind-Up Girl, because I just felt it would just be dishonest of me to say that The Wind-Up Girl, given the wonderful writing that I think it has, you know, will be surpassed by Djeli Clark's novel here. So I'm not going to be able to give it to The Wind-Up Girl, but there are definitely areas in this novel that had me challenging this position. I want to be clear in that. The other novel that I want to highlight is The Saint of Bright Doors by Vajra Chandrasekhara, the 24 Nebula award-winning novel. Because I did see similarities there again, where Chandrasekhara's world had these bright magic doors, and it was sort of an alternate universe almost, right, where the technology was almost like ours, but it was also magical at times as well, and it definitely took you places that I was just not expecting to be taken. So a lot more complex, a lot more themes covered that I thought was just a wonderful debut novel. And I'd have to say that the writing was definitely, for my liking, better than what we saw in Djeli Clark's. So I've sort of made up my mind, but it was a difficult one because at times, just purely from a enjoyment point of view, it's definitely a worthy Nebula award-winning novel. And one of the things that constantly came to mind as I was reading this novel was, man, I would really love to see this on the big screen. I think this would make a great movie adaptation. So if you're a movie producer out there, I'd say please have a read of this one and see what your imagination could do when it comes to the big screen. Because I reckon this one definitely has some wonderful world building that I reckon would translate to a movie just wonderfully. But as a book, as a piece of fiction, I'm going to have to say, I'm going to give it to the other debutee on the list in Vajra Chandrasekhara, and I'm going to place a Master of Djinn just below that one on what is a very crowded seaside. We may need to start shuffling things around and get the board to flip to get them all on there. Hey, have you read Djeli Clark's novel, A Master of Djinn? This is the first I've read of his. I've not read his short stories, but I know he gets a lot of accolades for his short stories, so I'm definitely going to get stuck into those to see if this world has got some more potential. But I'd love to see a follow-up and maybe a couple of more years of Djeli Clark's and a couple of more books, under his belt, may just see him be one of the great science fiction and fantasy writers out there. I'd love to hear from you as always. Until next time, I've been Peter. Next week's going to be a huge mammoth book that I'll be reviewing for you. So I hope you join me for that and hit that like and notification bell so you don't miss out. And I'll see you next time in the shed.